Okay, we still have a couple of people logging in, but I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to say welcome to everyone. Welcome to today's webinar discussion. This is part of our CMMC webinar series, and this is part 2 of the series. You know, we're going to be covering quite a few things today. Today we're going to be covering and discussing CIS controls and really just how best practices can help with CMMC compliance implementation. We're going to spend about 30 minutes with our speaker, 30 to 40 minutes with our speaker on this topic, and then we will open it up for a Q&A. Today's speaker is Tony Sager. Tony Sager is the Senior Vice President and Chief Evangelist for the Center for Internet Security. He leads the development of the CIS Controls, a worldwide consensus project to find and support technical best practices in cybersecurity, and champions the use of the controls and other solutions gleaned from previous cyber attacks to improve global cyber defense. And I would like to say a huge welcome to Tony. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Appreciate it, and appreciate everyone's time, everyone who's called in today.
Excellent. Well, Tony, I went ahead and passed control your way. You should be able to go ahead and let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I'll pass that to you.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. And just so you know, again, we will be doing a Q&A at the end. If there are any questions throughout as Tony is speaking, feel free to submit those questions. We are collecting all questions. We've had people email questions in as well. So feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar. We're going to go ahead and group them all together at the end. And feel free to just ask away. We want to do our best to make sure we get all questions answered. Oh, and
okay.
the biggest question is, are we recording this? Will this be available? Yes, that is definitely the biggest question that's come in so far. We are recording this. This actually will be available tomorrow. You will receive an email with a link to the recorded webinar, and it will be on our website as well. So thank you.
Okay, and a big thank you to everyone that's joined us today for this webinar. It's a pleasure to talk about CMMC, about the Center for Internet Security and what we're doing about it and all that kind of stuff. So thanks so much to our friends at SimCorp also for giving us a chance to be part of this excellent series. It's a complex topic. It's gotten a lot of discussion, certainly here. I'm in the Baltimore, Washington area and former Defense Department civilian. So it's been a really interesting ride and a lot of complexity. The DoD, it's hard to describe unless you're in it, the scale of the challenges in front of us there. So, kudos to those that have really tried to give this some excellent thought and put together a good program around supply chain security. So I'll talk about a number of things, as Jacqueline said, 30, 40 minutes at the max. A few ideas I want to seed with you and some thoughts about the alignment of what we do at the center as a nonprofit and the challenges of the department and what it's trying to achieve here. So with that, whoops, let me get the technology under control. Just a quick introduction to the Center for Internet Security. We describe ourselves as a small but mighty nonprofit company, less than 300 people. And the company was founded, we just celebrated our 20th birthday last fall, and 20 years is like a long time in this cyber business. But the company was formed for the creation of what we call CIS benchmarks. So if you're familiar with a STIG, a security technical implementation guide, if you're familiar with a NIST checklist or a security guide from the National Security Agency, think of this.
Sorry to interrupt.
Benchmarks. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Your slides aren't fitting all the way onto the screen.
All right. Can we declare victory on this, or shall we?
Yeah. Let's just go for it.
Okay. Sorry, audience. My apologies. This is very odd. I mean, we've all had so much practice at this stuff. Now you'd think we'd have figured this all out. Okay, so real quick background, Center for Internet Security, a small nonprofit. We started, as I mentioned, around CIS benchmarks. And if you remember that time in history, very late 90s, 1990, 98, 99, 2000, that was the time when things like DISA STIGs, NSA security guides, and so forth really took off. And it became kind of a thing, especially across government. In fact, we even released the NSA security guides to the public in June of 2001. So there were a lot of these floating around. And CIS was really formed around the idea of having an independent nonprofit that was doing similar kind of work, gathering experts, looking at a new piece of technology, a particular component, for example, a Windows desktop, and figuring out how do I configure this for best security effect, given the emerging world of all these different sort of attacks and problems. And like everyone else in the business over the last few years, we're cloudifying, moving to the cloud. So the value of CIS benchmarks is now embedded in what we call hardened images, which you can get through any of the major cloud providers. So this is the idea, again, of gathering experts. How do I take a particular component of that's vital to IT and security and configure it for best security effect? The CIS controls are a little bit later development. I'll talk more about that in just a bit, but that's really the topic of the day. You might not know that we have a nationwide 24/7 operational component. That is, we are the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or ISAC, sponsored by Homeland Security. And we're also the election infrastructure ISAC. And so you can imagine how much energy has gone into that in the recent past year. But it's kind of what you pictured. And until the COVID year, it was a room full of large screens and bleary-eyed people, all these incidents at the state, local, tribal, territorial level being reported in, analysis, response, helping people recover, then the advisories and bulletins, and sort of the pacing and operational content that goes with that kind of business. We also have a business component. So we have a funny business model where, I mentioned the benchmarks and controls, right? We're really a relatively small company. We're not producing this with a giant think tank full of people. We're doing it by organizing volunteers across the entire cyber ecosystem. So public and private, US, non-US, industry, government, all kinds of people get involved and help produce the content that we sort of manage, organize, and support from the Center for Internet Security. So, and that content is essentially given away, but we still have people to pay. So there's a business model that says membership gets you a certain set of services, and there's other sort of things like that allow us to operate the nonprofit, pretty lean, and still have this reach among all this, the volunteer labor that goes into producing this content. So the topic is really about the Center for Internet Security, CIS Controls, and just for context. So I'm at 5 years now, or coming up on 45 years in cybersecurity, almost all of that at the National Security Agency. So close to 35 years, all of that in information assurance. And what's known there as information assurance, which originally started as communication security, or ComSec, and really all of that in security testing of one type or another. So I spent, if you looked at my 30-something years, conceptually, I would divide it into thirds. So the first third is the business of finding flaws in technology and in systems, learning the craft. And I started in mathematics, so it was looking at the mathematics of encryption and randomization, initialization, and key functions around cryptography like that. So I switched fairly early in my career to computer science and started worrying about things like flaws in software, flaws in operating systems and components, and then up through and including things like product testing for the DoD, live testing of operational systems, and so forth. So I had the honor of running at one point, I'm fairly certain by a large measure, the largest vulnerability finding machine in the US government dedicated to defense. So if you ever heard of or dealt with the NSA Red Team or the Blue Team, ever used an NSA security guide, got involved in any of the security automation standards and so forth from NIST and places like that, you were probably bumping into people that worked in our group. And so a very big reach and so forth. But as I mentioned, we started releasing some of this guidance to the public in June of 2001. And that was based on a recognition that we have a shared problem and we need to think about shared solutions. And so once that happened, I found myself out in the public talking about this. And that's where that chief evangelist title came from, by the way. But the notion was, here's what we're doing. We're part of the community at the National Security Agency. Here's what we're bringing to the fight, right? Here's the security guides and the practices and so forth that we've identified as the most important. And much to my surprise, people started to ask me questions that I'd never heard before. And I have to reveal a character flaw here. Obviously, I never had a job where I had to solve these problems. My career was about pointing other people's flaws out. And then people would ask me what were, for them, the natural questions. Where do I begin? What do I do first? My boss has a limited attention span. I have a limited budget, right? And I don't know where to begin. And that started to haunt me and to think about that problem, which was really the last third of my career, right? I had a first third about technical craft. The middle third was about managing organizations, which allowed me to see a scale of failure, right? See in all these different environments across the whole department, the intelligence community, lots of the government, lots of the industry. And the last third was trying to figure out what's going wrong here. Why do we keep seeing the same problems over and over again? And you could conclude that people just don't care, they're not working hard enough. That's never true in my experience. People were working really hard. In fact, they were working too hard. They were overwhelmed by the problem. And so these questions about where do I begin were natural, right? You have to start someplace. But if you're overwhelmed with security guidance and market claims and competing security frameworks, then you just don't know where to begin. So I gathered a small group of people and said, look, no, we literally had an afternoon meeting. No one leaves the room till we all agree on a small number of things that our friends should do. Friends being, Defense Department, intelligence community types. And the goal there was to get kind of past these infinite to-do lists and large control catalogs and help people get started. So small in my vocabulary is 5 to 7 things. And people in this business being what they are, I couldn't get them to agree until we got to the number 10. So a very modest 2-page letter left NSA and went to a number of friends. Basically said, if you don't know where to begin, based on our experience, do these things. And again, we had studied these attacks. We pretended to be adversaries through red teams and blue teams. And the folks that I was working with, I can say with a straight face, I'm one of the few lifelong defenders who's grew up inside an intelligence agency. So getting to participate in the national, nation-to-nation fight and really see how nation-state adversaries work from both sides of the equation here. So that modest 2-page letter, which I never thought I would see again, got picked up by folks like the SANS Institute. I'm sure you're familiar with them, the biggest teacher of this kind of stuff. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, a think tank in DC, and they took a really modest idea and turned it into something much bigger. And we were still participating, but we were not driving it at that point. But most people got to know the activity as the SANS Top 20. So there was kind of an initial flurry to bring the ideas together. It turned into a list of 20 things. And SANS took it over for safekeeping, for how do we keep this thing maintained. And SANS works at a very large scale. So posters, classes, conferences, training, all that kind of stuff started to come together around that. And then I retired in 2012 and through a variety of circumstances wound up helping out the SANS Institute on some special projects and wound up taking the project back over. They had treated it as kind of a community service project, right? How do we sort of organize volunteers to do this? And I came to the conclusion that it really needed a home, a place that was, not in a for-profit company, not kind of left on its own, but something to really sustain the idea. The ideas of let's focus in on what's really important. Let's worry about attacks first and about what are good things to do later. And so we turned this idea into what we called originally the critical security controls and now the CIS controls. And we landed in our permanent home in 2015, January of 2015, bringing this idea into the Center for Internet Security, where it was a natural partner with the CIS benchmarks. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But this is the long, strange journey this has been on here. It's really started very modestly. But all along the way, it built up sort of this volunteer army, right? People who started to support it, vendors who started to get interested and build tools around it. But the focus has always been the same. It isn't to compete with, large formal control catalogs or formal risk management frameworks. It's to bring experts together to help people do things that they all wish they had the experts to do, right? The kind of people you wish you could hire, but you can't find or can't afford, and let them tell you what is really important based upon their knowledge, their experience in dealing with incidents and so forth. So that's really the quick history of the CIS controls. They look like this. I won't go through it. 20 top level practices. You could call them domains. Another language Mark referred to it that. But that, our language at that time was controls. And there are 171 what we call safeguards, right? So think of them as more discrete, specific elements underneath those 20 categories. And those 171 line up pretty well with things like the individual items in 800-53, I'm sure many of you are familiar with that, and the items that are in CMMC and so forth. But so our term is safeguards because we really want to emphasize defensive value here. And the block that you see here is the graphic that we use to illustrate this. The idea was that the earlier ones are more important. There's no rigid 1 through N list that really works, but this was our best attempt to sort of organize these items into some logical coherency. And to, again, help people get started was really the focus. Now, what are the foundational elements of defense and what do you need to do about that? There's a thing we added just in the last couple of years we call implementation groups. So, we looked at large catalogs of hundreds, thousands of things to do, distilled it down to what we thought was really important within there, the safeguards. But even that was challenging, especially for really small businesses to get a handle on. So this notion of implementation groups was to really dig in and say, what is it that everyone should be doing, independent of whether they have the resources to do it or not, and whether they face high risk or not. What are really the core set of things that ought to be a part of even the smallest enterprises thinking about security? We call that implementation group 1. And then building on that, and this sort of feels like a CMMC thing, right? Add on to that implementation group 2, which is another set of things for higher risk, more resources, more expertise, more capability. And then 3, by the time you add them all together, you get the 171 safeguards. This is the graphic that illustrates that. Again, I won't go through it because the idea is very similar to a number of other programs and part of things like CMMC. I'm sorry, was there a question? Okay, I'll go on.
No question.
I want to also mention the CIS benchmarks, really what the company was founded upon, and this idea of configuration guidance. So configuration guidance is typically at a sort of component or infrastructure level, right? How do I best configure a mail server, a web server, a desktop, and so forth? And again, with a really small company, we are, I think, without even a contender in the horizon, the world's largest independent producer of such things. There are certainly, DIS is doing great work with STIGs. There's still some things that come out of NSA, the NIST checklist program. But when you look across this breadth here, this is not being produced by a think tank of people. This is produced by a small nonprofit organizing volunteers to come together to support and keep current all these different technologies. And if you glance down them, you'll see, we've gone from sort of desktops and applications to clouds to, to the virtualization platforms and all the different databases, productivity software, and things like that. And so very, very comprehensive. A lot of work goes into this. And my advice is, if you don't know where to start, always start with good configurations. That, to me, and in the work that we did at NSA, the failure to manage configurations well was at the core of almost every incident that we tried to deal with, and was the easy way in for any red team or any sort of testing activity. So I want to talk just briefly about this notion of security frameworks. Right? We must love security frameworks in this industry because we have so many of them, and they're of all sizes, shapes, and colors, and they range from what I would call the microscopic, very specific, discrete items. Install a firewall, install an application whitelisting program, up to what I would call the cosmic, right? Really large scale that are not very specific, but sort of challenge you to, here's how to think about and organize the problem. And there's sort of everything in between. Just for your context, the CIS Controls aims for what we call a prescriptive, but not vendor dependent. That is, we try to be specific about what we think are the most important things to do, recognizing there are other things that you could do, should do, will do, but to be really focused on those being prescriptive enough so that you have an idea what you need to do without sort of massive amounts of interpretation or complete dead ends, et cetera, but without being too specific about the technology or the vendor that's being used, right? The goal is to be agnostic to those, but to be really clear about what's important to do. But any security framework, when you're either, you might be choosing one, you might be told that you have to follow one, whatever,
can I
the boss might decide.
for delivery?
You would say, these are the kind of questions that I would ask about them. For example, how do I know that these actions are effective?
It looks
right?
like somebody's not muted.
Out.
Possibly, Tony. It looks like maybe on another screen you have something unmuted.
0374.
Yep, I hope their delivery comes as successfully.
I'm going to start with the garlic bread with cheese.
Oh, somebody is not
and
muted.
some jalapeno.
Everybody
jalapeno
should
poppers.
be muted.
And
The dinner sounds pretty good. Oh.
Yeah, and then
Okay.
the falafel over rice.
Okay, try that now, Tony. I think it was your other. Yeah, jalapeno poppers did sound good, but I think your other screen was unmuted, so I muted the second login. You should be good now, Tony.
Oh, okay. Well, I appreciate that. Again, boy, now I'm hungry. So back to this. questions to ask about any security framework. So how do I know these are worth doing, right? There's a question you should always think about when you look at these security frameworks. And it turns out historically, for most of our time here in this industry, the answer is because somebody else said so, right? Because it's in a STIG, it's in a NIST checklist, it's in a consultant told me this. I have to do this, so I don't really care whether they're effective. I just have to do them. And from my view, that's not good enough. So I'll talk a little bit later about how do we know whether security things provide you any value, right? What do I get from them? But several of these questions are the things I referenced earlier. How do I get started? Is there an on-ramp, right? I only have a limited budget. My boss has limited attention span. I need some quick wins to get going, or I get fired. Those are really important questions and things that you would love to see answered in a security framework, right? Not trying to overwhelm you with too many things, but to really help you get focused in on sort of foundational things that are not just throwaways, right? They're not just quick wins to get something on the books, but they give you a way to build upon what you need to do later. How do I prioritize is the most frequent question I get outside. Again, there's a lot of complexity to these questions. So believe me, there's not trivial answers, but there are important things that we should ask about each of these. Another key question, it's rare in this industry that you get to start from scratch, right? So what you really want to do is figure out what's the best I already have. What do I have already in my environment? What are the processes that I already execute in my environment? How much value do I get from these already relative to these the requirements implied in this security framework? And these are really important issues because I used to ask all my vendor friends when I was at NSA, and because they would give me numbers like, well, the customer, let's see, only uses N% of what we sold them in terms of security value. And I never heard a number bigger than 40%. Now, your mileage may vary, but that's what vendors told me over and over again, that the customers didn't really maximize the security value of what they'd already purchased. And, you can kind of see that, right? People are always looking for a better solution. A lot of this, and the reason we operate so, with such reach as a volunteer army is that, in our experience, most of us learn best from someone who's already done it, right? Some enterprise that's like us, someone similarly situated, perhaps in a similar sector. And how do we find them? How do we learn from them what they've done, right? And I don't want to do that sort of in a complex formal way. I want to find people and get their lessons learned so I can bring those into my environment. A lot of this also is about how am I doing and measurement of progress, right? And it's also another unspoken secret of the business that probably the most frequently used workflow management, GRC, and overall management tool in the business is actually Microsoft Excel. I can't tell you how many variations I've seen of that, where people use that to track action items and sort of keep account of what tools they're using or the progress of implementation and so forth. And I get it, that's what we all have, and it's adequate for some circumstances, but it's not really a great long-term answer. A key question that we often get is, how do I compare to others? So part of assessing yourself is knowing kind of where do you fit, maybe within your sector, your industry, companies of your size, companies that are face a similar risk, companies that are part of the same supply chain, right? My phrase is, no one wants to be the lonely antelope at the edge of the herd. So you don't want to be last. You don't want to be in that dreaded, bottom 30 percentile or whatever, where your practices are so much weaker. Whether that's right or wrong, it's a strong incentive for management action. And so people often ask that kind of question. How do I compare to others? A key part, and this comes up in the context of CMMC also, and all these do, how much could I automate? Part of the reason we struggle today is there is so much grunt work to be done. And again, it's not that system administrators, designers are lazy or they don't care. It's just, and it's overwhelming. Technology is complex, it's fragile, bad guys are determined, right? This is how they make their living. And therefore, we can't count on human beings being able to do the right thing at the right moment in time. We really need much more support of automation and sort of more ways to let technology manage these things for us, especially the routine, so that we can save human beings for the things that only human beings can do. What's the vendor marketplace around your security framework? And how do I know that the good intention of the framework is in fact implemented by these vendors? Is there some sort of model or program to certify and so forth? Every time you move information or data or content from place to place, you have a question of, did it get transferred faithfully? How do I know that the best practice ideas from a CIS are actually embedded in that vendor tool? And when that tool is run, how do I know the report accurately reflects what was originally said from CIS? And how do I build some sort of a chain of trust, you might call it, or some other way to recognize when that has been broken, right? Because if you don't do that, then anybody who comes in to look afterwards, an auditor or someone who wants to question what's going on, that's a spot that they go for, right? Because you can't demonstrate clear transfer of sort of the knowledge from place to place. And then the final one on this page, how does this relate to other frameworks? We're approaching what we at CIS call the multi-framework era. Almost every company that we deal with, or state and local government, is struggling because they're getting besieged by security frameworks, supply chain questionnaires, all kinds of questions, the legal system, regulators, state level legislation about what are you doing? Are you a responsible citizen? Are you using reasonable practices? Are you using best practices? Everyone's being asked these things. That is, we're spending an extraordinary amount of time now demonstrating that we've done the right thing. And that tends to take away from doing the right thing, right? We really want to spend most of our energy, our resources, our precious people time on sort of the problem and the solutions to it, and manage as much as possible reuse of data or evidence or so forth to demonstrate to others that we're doing things successfully, that are in concert with a framework and compliance with whatever we have to comply with, et cetera. And so these are all the kinds of things that swirl around as we think about these problems about frameworks. And some of these we've, I think, made some progress on at CIS, and I'm happy to share with you quickly here. And some of them are just the things that are just across our entire industry and we need to think about as an industry. One of the things I mentioned talking about, how do I believe, or do I believe that the recommendations provide value? And I'm going to, this is a quick cartoon I drew a few years ago. From opinions to data. I have a dream, that someday we'll make logical decisions about cybersecurity based upon real data, not upon opinions. Opinions are important. Judgment is important. Those really matter. But so much of this is about wizards out arguing each other, right? What's the right thing to do, and what's the most effective thing, or what's the most important threat to worry about? And I always say that wizardry as a industry model is great job security for old folks like me, or young folks too, but it's terrible public policy, right? It's not reproducible. You can't repeat it. You can't scale it. And so you can't turn it into things that will drive behavior. You could just be impressed by it. And so we really need to think about how do we bring more data, more rigor in thinking. So this is the journey, the multi-year journey that the controls have been on, and the benchmarks are now part of too. And literally, I told you how the CIS controls started, right? It's the, pardon the language, 5 geeks in the room, because they were all geeks, because I was one of them. And we just sat around and argued till we wrote something down, right? We'd agreed on 10 things. And that's not unusual. And these are not 10 or 5 normal people. These are people who have a lot of experience in attack and defense and nation state adversaries and all that kind of stuff. So this is good. And you get to benefit from the experience of people who've done a lot of neat things, but it's not very scalable. And you can look at their output, the original top 10 list, and say, you know what, those folks at NSA seem to know what they're doing, at least in this case, and therefore we're going to use that. Okay, and that works up to some level of scale. When SANS gets a hold of something, if you've dealt with the SANS Institute, they don't do things at small scale, they do large scale. So 5 geeks in a room turns into 5,000 geeks on the mailing list, right? And conceptually. And so you bring a worldwide community to bear. Lots more opinions, lots more ideas, a lot more experience. But at the end, you're sort of capturing judgment in a piece of paper or a document or some sort of form that you can share broadly. And you can say, a lot of good people are involved with that. That's great, I'm going to use that. And again, you get a certain amount of distance from that, a certain amount of value. What I started doing in 2013, and the language here is a little bit formal, mapping to authoritative problem summaries. Basically, this was to look at things. There was an emerging marketplace of things, not really market, but giveaways, right? Annual summaries of attacks. The Verizon data breach report is probably by far the best known, but Symantec, McAfee, Palo Alto, CrowdStrike, everyone does something like this now, right? Based upon their business model. They do great analysis. They try to look for trends, summaries, and so forth. They pass it through a marketing filter, and they produce some lovely document, which is typically given away, maybe at the cost of your email address or something. But the idea was, especially I started with Verizon, this represents a very large mass market view of what's going on out there. And if we could look at the great analysis, we don't need all the data. What we need is a summary of it. What are the patterns, the trends, the bins, the categories of attack? And can I use those to try and choose wisely defensive actions, right? Can I map from those into the things that would be most effective to deal with them. So you have a sort of a data set that's being refreshed annually, has great data scientists and a great data model underneath the hood. And then from there, can I use that as a basis for choosing wisely in defense? That started in, if you look at the 2013 Verizon Data Breach Report, you'll see in the recommendations sections the first ever reference to the CIS controls, the mapping from the conclusions of Verizon into the CIS controls. And it was a start. And so we've continued that over the years since. We've been moving further to the right, starting to add things like, and lots of folks across the industry are doing things like testing out good practices in honeypots or through lab testing or through sort of controlled experiments, in addition to the traditional manual analysis, right? Let's look at the last year's malware and see how a well-configured system would have fared against that. So I call this, we're moving to the right here, right? Bringing more rigor, more data, more formality. This next stage, the mapping to and from standard languages, patterns, templates. If you're familiar with terms, I'll explain in a minute, the things like the MITRE ATT&CK model and so forth, MITRE ATT&CK framework and things like that, that's in the right direction. Those are great steps that really help us think about abstracting all this sort of narrative data about what's going on into some structural elements that allow us to do much more complicated analysis and also can drive the front end collection of data so that analysis is much more tractable, much more doable. And so the idea is to keep pushing ourselves to the right. As you go to the right, you get all these benefits, and some of them are on the bottom: greater leverage, scalability, repeatability, right? You move away from the 5 experts in a room into something that allows you to make a statement about, wait a minute, the effectiveness of a defensive recommendation against a very large data set. And that's a really important step that allows folks like us at CIS to put more rigor under the hood of why do we recommend this or not that, or how would I prioritize this over that, by establishing some sort of security value against the real target, which is the attacks that we see, right? That's kind of the idea here. So this is just a conceptual model that we've been using here. I'll show you that, and pardon this is actually a working diagram that you're seeing here. We call our way of doing this the community defense model. So if you look at the little gray diagram on the left, right, you need a source of data, right? What is really going on? I don't want to make it up. I don't want to count on one person's experience. What is a rational source of data? What sort of a model do I have? Can I pull together the model specifically of the attacker, right? I can't look at every attack. I need a way to abstract it. And the industry's been doing that for years through things like the Lockheed Martin kill chain, the Mandiant APT1 model, and things like that. And the point of all this, at least for the kind of work that we do at CIS, and that I think most of you care about, is not about more rapid sharing of attacks. It's about translation into action, right? I don't have time to read millions of data points of badness. What I really want is to translate them into a smaller number of positive, constructive things I can do about it. That's kind of the idea here. So just very briefly, starting from the top, and this style of diagramming, if you're not familiar with it's called concept maps. Just think nouns and verbs. That's all you have to think about. Blocks are nouns and the connectors are verbs, right? So I'll read from the top. The CIS controls are made up of CIS safeguards. I told you that earlier, which we map to whether in the MITRE ATT&CK model known as attack mitigations. We did this in an intermediate step. This will probably disappear in version 2 and go right to what are called attack techniques. So the MITRE terminology is, to build a structure which I could describe what I would call the atomic elements of attack, right? What are the tactics used by attackers? And within each tactic or step, what are the different techniques that they might use to achieve, right, through that step? If you look at the recent CISA, CISA, DHS, CISA bulletin on SolarWinds, you will see a great example of them doing exactly this, breaking down kind of an attack into these tactics and to these techniques. So what we do is look at the CIS safeguards then and map them indirectly through mitigations to attack techniques. Because what we're trying to establish is these safeguards. If I look at a set of attack techniques, what we call the security function, what security function does that safeguard play or execute against one or more of those techniques? Okay, does that make sense? The idea is to be able to look discreetly, not to say, do this because it's a good thing, do it because it performs a security function and not a generic one, but against a specific technique as called out in the MITRE ATT&CK framework, right? So that's the kind of modeling part from the top down. You look at the bottom, we start with the DBIR is the Data Breach Investigations Report and from Verizon. That's the one we started with because it's the easiest for us to work with. From there, we identify, is the verb, a set of attack types that we care about. For us, we picked out the top, what we call the top 5 attacks, the ones that everybody should worry about. Those attack types can then be described in what we call the attack pattern. The attack pattern is just made up of the different techniques strung together. All right, so the idea is we start from sort of the top down around the model of safeguards and the value, the function it performs against individual techniques. We start from the bottom from real data, break it down into attack types and patterns, which then map into techniques. And that's sort of the common meeting place here, right? The idea is we want to make sure that the CIS safeguard, it's not that just it performs a security function, but it provides value against some sort of pattern of real life attack as described, in Verizon and then as sort of laid out in the attack framework. So this is a working diagram. So it gives you an idea if you look at the lines on the left there. The idea is safeguards, and this is a language that we have chosen to use, right? A security function is sort of a generic benefit provided by a safeguard. When you map it to an attack type, a specific type of attack, which is made up of techniques, then we talk about value. Okay, and the idea is we're trying to establish the security value of both individual recommendations or safeguards, as well as a bundle of them. The bundle might be the CIS controls in total. It might be implementation group 1. It might be the ones that are found in CMMC. This is a general model of sort of how to think about these kind of problems. So I don't want to overwhelm you with this. And I'm sorry if it's a little bit too geeky for some of you, but the idea is about bringing data, rigor, and establishing value for recommendations. We think this is an essential part of the evolution of the industry. And this is our way of thinking about it. We're open to feedback. And everything we've done, we've put in the public for argument, improvement, feedback, and so forth. So please don't hesitate. And this is all found on our website. But earlier I talked about those questions, right? Questions to ask about any security framework. These are just a list of some of the things. We talk about what I call the CIS Controls ecosystem, right? It's not about the list is our slang phrase. That is, there are great lists of things to do all over this industry, right? And you can go get them from numerous government agencies. There's great data from NIST, right? We work closely with our friends there. Every October in cybersecurity awareness month, every magazine and so forth in the industry has a top 5 things to do, top 10, top 3, top 20, whatever. It's not about the list. It's about the ecosystem that builds up to help you achieve the good intentions of that list. So I gave you the example of the community defense model at the top, implementation groups. We produce what we call companion guides. So looking at the controls is one thing, but how do we refine them for a particular technology? How do we apply them for small, medium businesses? How do we apply them to cases where you're outsourcing, right? So we create that documentation again with our volunteers and with our staff, and that's a part of the total ecosystem. I mentioned, we learn best from others. We've been collecting now over several years use cases of adoption by individual enterprises and at what I call the institutional level, right? States that point to the CIS controls, regulations that reference them, frameworks like the NIST cybersecurity framework, which points to the controls as an informative reference, lots of non-US stuff happening, references to us in the NISA standards and places like that. But also what we've been doing is building tools and giving them away as part of our membership model. So things like the control self-assessment tool. Remember, I talked about Excel as the universal GRC tool of the industry. CSAT is a tool that we provide, and again, there's many thousands of accounts now that people can use to track their own progress against the controls. And then providing some data, they also get then a sense of, we're able to do things like talk about communities and the progress within the communities. It also helps us at CIS because this is the first place where we've really been able to rigorously collect things like, what are the controls that no one seems to be able to actually implement or safeguards? And what are the ones that everybody does? And what does that tell us? Are we asking for the wrong thing, the right thing, too hard a thing, not specific enough a thing? And that allows us to refine the way we make recommendations in the first place. The control assessment specification I'll mention briefly in just a minute, but the idea there is we believe strongly that we have to automate a lot more of this. And to do so means we have to look at our requirements, right? Safeguards in our language. And what should we test for? what artifacts would we extract from a system? What machine things would we look at to tell us we have successfully met or are executing that safeguard? Here's a lesson that we have learned and we have tried to put into place for the last 2 or 3 versions of the CIS controls. If you don't ask very well up front, if you're not specific, prescriptive, and concrete about what you ask, then automation is almost impossible because you have to kind of make it up, right? What am I going to really look for? So this, you don't think of it as a requirements and then I figure out what to do about it. What we've tried to do is think through this whole life cycle, right? If we are very crisp, our slang term internally at CIS is, one safeguard, one ask. Only ask for one thing when you write, so that then we can define a measurement for it. We can define system artifacts. We can define, it's kind of a whole life cycle for each one of those. That's our goal. We're not perfect at it, but we're pretty good and we've gotten better. And the assessment specification allows us then to say, for the CIS safeguards, here are the set of them that are automatable, and here's the authoritative way to do it. And we produce it as a specification that then vendors can pick up on, right? And the idea is, we want there to be a vendor and commercial and open source ecosystem that helps people do these things. And so we can make that possible by the way we ask up front, right? To think through this whole life cycle. And security IT vendors, obviously, we are well known in the ecosystem, and our friends at SimCore support our products and all that. And so all that's, that does happen naturally, but we're trying to make it sort of more refined, more specific through things like the assessment specification. A couple other things I'll mention: this cross mappings to everything else. I mentioned before this, or the phrase about we're entering the multi-framework era. This stuff is eating people alive, including us, by the way. We get flooded with supply chain questionnaires because we're a small business too. And so this idea of how do I talk about the important things to do that I am doing and answer all these different frameworks, right, without having to do lots of new work. One solution is about how do I map from one to the other. And my view is that, and this is our philosophy, right, those of us that create these lists and frameworks and so forth have a responsibility to make this stuff easier. And therefore our part in it, the way we're going to help, is by cross-mapping to everything else conceptually, including CMMC 171, 853, and all those kinds of things. Because if we don't do it, somebody else has to do it, right? You have to do it for yourself. You have to pay somebody to do it. You have to engage a commercial service to do it for you. And look, we're the source of our stuff. So we would like to be the authoritative source of how it maps to everything else. And that's something that we would just give away, right, as part of our contribution to the cause here. And then the last thing I mentioned the benchmarks and hardened images, but also don't underestimate the power of this active volunteer community. We run a closed social media platform where these discussions take place. And so we really bring people together to help learn from each other and sort of support each other in this both evolution of our guidance, but also the support of it. So a couple of quick things about CMMC here. I know in part 1 of the series, you have all the basics, and I'm sure most of you are familiar. Let's just look at the practices level here very quickly. I'll mention, this is, I'm sure, very familiar to you all here, the number of practices by level and the numbers that are add up here. Let's take a look real quick about the CMMC practices and how they map into CIS safeguards, right? So again, we use a different numbering scheme in naming, but it's okay. We're committed to sort of make all this align, create the content from CIS that makes it possible. We really care about this because many of our adopters are small businesses that, are going to have to deal with CMMC. And so they want our help so that they don't have to throw away their action plans and their strategies and their technology, but that they can use what we become an on-ramp for them, right? A way for them to sort of accessibly become part of this community without having to start from scratch. So I'll just, if you can glance down here, that the grade chart to the right. So for the CMMC's levels, and we just looked at 1, 2, 3 here, just to keep it simple. The number of practices is in the middle box. And then we have an upcoming version 8 of the controls. We just looked at what percent, if we map from our stuff into the CMMC practices here, what percent line up very well. And you can see it turns out consistently around 68 to 70%. So are we missing something, or what's going on here? Why isn't it 100%, right? Well, believe me, cross-mapping is tricky business. These are the ones in particular in level 1 of CMMC that don't map, and you can see them, right? These have to do with things like physical handling and facilities and visitors and so forth. And we just don't deal with those in the CIS controls, right? That was always broader than what we were dealing with and dealt with very nicely in existing government documents. So we just don't handle those, and that's fine. But we're really clear about the ones that we don't map to. And these are part and parcel of lots of government contracts and important, but they're just not the kind of, again, technology focused, cyber focused stuff that we've been a part of. So it's okay, right? There are going to be things that map well and don't map well, and that are not included just by design from the way we do that. And we have all that documented and clearly laid out for you. I will point out, I talked before about the controls assessment specification. That is the potential to automate the individual safeguards. It turns out that our CAS specification covers nicely all the CMMC level 1 practices, except the physical ones that are noted up higher there, right? So what that tells us is that, vendors that are already moving with us towards CAS are actually lined up pretty well to support automation for CMMC level 1. And again, we will produce any mapping or any statement that makes that clear how that works. So this is, I think, good news for all of us, and allows us to get focused on what are the most effective tools for those that are part of the CIS family that will allow them to work sort of elegantly with the CMMC. A couple other things I'll say here. So I asked this mapping stuff, I cannot tell you how much work goes into this and how tedious it can be. And so I asked the person that we call our chief cartographer at CIS, what a day of his work is like. And this is the security cross-mapping eye test. There is, I'm not going to walk through this, obviously, but the point is there is a massive amount of detail to map across security frameworks. And it's partly because we've created a problem, right? Different frameworks are at different levels of abstraction, using different wording, implying different technologies. And so it takes some clear analysis, some clear thinking to make a meaningful map from sort of A to B and back again. And what we do, we have a clearly documented mapping methodology. Everything we produce, again, is out in the public, so we can offer it to you for an inspection, feedback, and so forth. But it's really important to think about these things because we are making people bleary-eyed. And I've talked to many vendor friends who have to do this same exercise on their own. And our goal is we would provide some sort of machinable version of this so that for those, again, that use our stuff, how do I cross-map it to others? We will provide you, what we believe is the authoritative mapping across these things here. One last thing, and this is actually the opening slide from a talk that our chief cartographer and I are going to be giving in the fall, and that cartographer happens to be my son. So he gives me an honest answer when I ask him what's really hard about these problems, and we call it "Here Be Dragons" because it feels like we're going into the unknown here, and this is obviously an old pirate map, and we're entering territory that we know is dangerous, and so we're trying to figure out how do we make this as simple and as elegant and easy for our adopters as possible. Because this is a big part of what drives people's behavior, right? Is how do I explain what I'm doing, especially when I'm in an environment where I have to explain it to multiple parties, the regulators, the different security frameworks, the legal system, et cetera, et cetera. And so with all that, I'll wrap up here. What I tried to give you was an example of like why we think about things the way we do at CIS, in particular about the security value of best practices, where we're going with that, how those things line up with what CMMC is trying to do. We're in for the ride because, again, many of our adopters really care about this and they've asked for our help. They need our help, and that's what we do here. We have to produce the kind of materials I talked about, the mappings, the sort of the documentation that makes it easy for people to use both. Our surveys show lots of people use two frameworks, even when they get a chance to do them voluntarily. Like it's often that people use the NIST cybersecurity framework, for example, for high-level things, and our stuff more for action plans and technical sort of roadmaps and things like that. And that's all good. So so the idea is to bring all those things together to help you think about that. All the materials I talked about are available through our website, or you can reach out to me, and happy to make all this available, and your feedback on what you think you need, right? We are driven by the feedback of the adopter community and the volunteers that work with us. So again, we're not a giant think tank, we're a do tank, right? We get things done, and we do it by bringing the best minds that we can find together, crafting the content, making it available to the public, and then supporting it through that model. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, turn it back to Jacqueline first, but let me apologize for the technical glitches up front. It all worked before, right? But, here we are, those things happen. It's a rainy day here in my part of Maryland. So, all bets are off as far as internet service. And we may
It's Murphy's Law, right? It's Murphy's Law. It happens. It's just,
this is our life being online and the occasional technical glitch. So thank you everyone for your patience. I look forward to your questions. If we don't get to your questions during this, again, this is what I do in my second career here. My contact information is on the screen. I'm easy reach on LinkedIn or directly, or if you want to hear a little bit about the history of my cyber life at the NSA, I started a personal blog, which is sort of tales of growing up in cyber with the government. So with that, thank you very much, Jacqueline. I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. You know, I think that I'm speaking for a lot of people who are saying this. You always give such great information. And this is probably the most anticipated part, is being able to ask the questions. We've had quite a few questions come in, so I'm kind of grouping them as they come in here. One of the first questions is in regards to CMMC being adopted by other agencies, more as a vehicle to put the controls and the accountability. Do you foresee that happening? Do you foresee CMMC being adopted by other agencies as a vehicle to put the controls and accountability, you know, into the government or into other areas?
You know, that was a very hot discussion, right, of several months ago, and has come back again with a new administration. So I will say this, you know, CMMC is really important because the Defense Department has a massive supply chain challenge, right? And it needs something, so hooray. But guess what? So does Homeland Security, so does rest of government. So we need ways to think about these things that are universal. And, you know, suppliers, right, want to have a rich assortment of buyers, right, people that use them, and they don't want to have a separate process for every different government agency. So the more commonality we can find, the better. And commonality is something that here's my experience, we have to design in, not hope for and cross map to afterwards, right? I showed you that eye test, right? Cross mapping is possible, but if we didn't design in sort of compatibility across these, then it's a really difficult challenge. And by the way, everything you cross map to is being updated at a different pace, right? So you're now cross mapping to things that are all in motion. So it is a nightmare to do. So we need some way to think about this. We also need to think about cost effectiveness in a whole, you know, as a kind of a whole community. So I don't know if CMMC is the ultimate answer, but I know that we need sort of a universal answer around this, and whether it's for the government, and then lots of other folks will tag along, or are there common elements? You know, there's a lot of great folks who've been thinking about these problems in supply chain for some time. But I think you know, for my thinking, and just speaking for me, key issues are affordability and automation. And affordability means, because many of our small suppliers, and this is the way we think about it, you know, in fact, most of our economy will never hire a security professional, right? They don't have the ability to think this through and do threat analysis and, you know, all this kind of stuff that's implied with the traditional build it yourself for market that we've all been a part of. And so we need more of this to be built in. Now, automation means I get it from a vendor instead. I get it through a managed service provider instead, you know, and all that. So sort of building the ideas into more delivery mechanisms that have scale, that are cost efficient for smaller participants in supply chains, I think is essential. But yeah, so I don't have a crisp answer on is CMC the answer, but I'd say frankly, every government agency, frankly, in the last few months, right, because of the recent incidents, is now sweating supply chain. And if you, I'm sure everyone follows the press, right, the new principals in the new administration are all grappling with the fallout from SolarWinds and these big supply chain awareness things that have popped up. So I think it's a really exciting time for all this, and I really think it's worth sort of designing this as a broad public-private community. So thank you.
Okay. Here's another question that we have in regards to auditing. Is CIS Controls something we should audit for once a quarter, or should we be moving towards continuous compliance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you know, and there isn't a fixed answer, another non-fixed answer thing here. So we like the model of continuous measurement. And that's one reason why we, you know, okay, for every safeguard, what's its measurement? Can we define it in the specification and so forth? Because that really supports this idea of automation. And so for part of scalability, yeah, and this is a CMMC challenge, right? You know, the government tends to define things that are, with all the best intentions, human intensive. We're going to send an army of people out there to go verify that people have done the right thing. We're going to write big reports, right? Send them all back to a central place and analyze them. And, you know, despite good intentions, not all of that is scalable. And what you also want to say is, okay, I grew up in a world where, hey, we're going to do a penetration test every 3 years, whether we need it or not. Well, 3 years is an eternity in this business now, right? So this idea of episodic security, I'd call it, is starting to get really out of date. In fact, has been out of date for quite some time. Pardon my cough here. And so building in this idea of, yeah, there are times when you want to have a human verify and inspect, right? That makes sense. But if you also want to be able to quickly, cost effectively sort of assess progress or the state of where an enterprise is, you also want enterprises to self-assess, right? To quickly look at where they are so they know where to improve. And you need that to be cost effective, right? And that's part of it. So the goal is, the department of CMMC, the goal is not to give everybody a test and punish the guilty. The goal is to have a rich assortment of suppliers, right, of all sizes and shapes and cost models. And so the goal is, you need to have a strong set of requirements, but depending on where people are, they know what the improvement plan is, right? They know how to progress, and you provide them with tooling that allows them to sort of between episodes manage their progression, right? Or to bring in someone else, or to have someone scan for them, or whatever the model might be, to improve continuously. So you have to have both. As far as the quarterly part goes, I mean, that's part of a risk model also, right? How often you read a log, how often you audit, and so forth. That depends a lot on the industry that you're in and the risk that you're willing to take. How current is your configuration management database? These are all risk issues, right? And in many cases, you don't need to look, with the sort of like all guns blazing, lots of human being power very often. If you have a well-designed sort of continuous set of measurements and a way to scan and a way to pull that information in. So I think both have to be part of the model. This is part of what CIS has discussed with the department also, how to bring some of the ideas I talked about today to help CMMC with a continuous measurement part of it. So we're big believers in that at CIS. We think we couple that with the notion of self-assessment. And there are a lot of security wizards out there that are groaning right now at me. Self-assessment is evil. People lie, cheat, and steal. I hear you, but let's get over ourselves. If we don't provide a means for people to get better, but I also we're not saying blind self-assessment, let them just write their name on the bottom of a piece of paper. Part of self-assessment is creating evidence where you get caught if you lie, frankly, right? That is, you want artifacts of the system that can always be verified later. And so that's a sensible way to do this that allows you to get the benefit of sort of a self-improvement plan, right? A way for people to sort of manage their improvement, because we do want many suppliers in the department. At the same time, evidence is created that allows you then to verify later that this is in fact the path that they're on. So I think you also need to sort of design this again as a whole.
Okay, excellent. Another question came in regards to a particular control or controls that you think is underserved or maybe overlooked. Anything you can elaborate on that, on a control or one particular control, or even a couple of controls that you think are underserved or overlooked?
Yeah, I don't know that. I will say that the foundational ones people don't give enough attention to, and because they can be hard, not theoretically hard, but operationally hard. Even knowing what you have, right? The sort of beginnings of the controls are around hardware inventory, software inventory. What do you actually own? And people often get stumped there. I think one of the reasons they get stumped is they sort of overthink it. Security, this is my experience, cybersecurity, so often we seek perfection and it's the enemy of the good, right? It's a classic case of perfection being the enemy of the good. And part of the reason is old folks like me, oh, what do you mean you don't have perfect knowledge of all this? Therefore, you spend tons more money and you can't do anything unless you can sort of deal with every possible use case I can dream up. And by the way, old folks like me, we can dream up attacks, use cases, vulnerabilities, all the what ifs. That's what we get trained to do, right, over decades. And so don't let sort of perfection be in the way. By the way, the bad guy's not perfect either. I lived with professional nation state bad guys for 35 years, right? They're really good at what they do. Don't let me fool you here. But they're not perfect. They don't like risk. They have their own risk model, right? They have their own, they want things to be safe from their perspective and cost effective from their perspective. Anyway, so thinking about the early ones is important because they're the foundation for the later ones. And that's kind of the way the controls will always arrange. So knowing what you have, do you have control of the installation and execution of software, right? When things execute that you don't expect or that haven't been authorized, do you have a way to manage that? Do you have a clear process? And these don't have to be gazillion dollar, high-tech solutions, right? They could be a mix of process things, sort of good management of the basically probably a Microsoft environment that you already have to manage these things. Right? So we're working also with Microsoft and folks like that. Again, this idea of what's the best we can do with what we already own. I think we have not done enough about that. And Microsoft has felt that because they're doing some neat stuff that they're putting out on that topic also. So we're going to try to come to some agreements about what really matters there. So the foundational ones I think are really important, and their importance. When I started to first speak publicly about this, people started to ask me, and I wasn't prepared for the question. Tell you how naive I was. What's the most important thing you should do? And you know what I said? It just popped into my head, and it turned out to be the right answer, I believe. Visibility. If you don't have visibility of your own environment, guess who has better visibility? The attacker does. They'll spend the time. They'll develop the technology to do the reconnaissance to figure out what you have, because that's you're their battlefield, right? You're their target environment. And so those first controls were always about this sort of notion of operational management, of IT visibility. And if you had that, you are like worlds ahead of, you're no longer easy pickings for the bad guys. The one other I'll mention, Jacqueline, that is you'll see come out in version 8 of the controls I mentioned, which is to be released at RSA this year. Is we moved up, we had one that was dedicated to data, identifying the most important data. It was kind of in the, I forget where it was, 13 or something like that. And through popular demand, that has moved up significantly. You'll see in the ordering. It's still being edited, so I won't mention it. But what's happened today, and it's all the virtualization, the cloud, right? All these different environments and work from home. Where is my data? Where did it go? It's right. Mobile devices. Oh my gosh. And so we really moved that up in the list. And it's not, the list is not intended to be one to end, as I've said. However, people really look at the ordering, right? Because they're looking for a message. And the message is, it's always been important. There's never a question. That's why it was always in the controls. But we've really, I think, spiked up the look at that in the next version because of the environment of the last couple of years, right? It wasn't just the work from home thing, but also the buildup of cloud and the hybrid environments and the mobile device, bring your own device environment. I mean, it's this, anyone who claims they know where all their data is probably not looking that hard. And so it is a great challenge for enterprises to make good decisions about that. Thanks.
Okay, we have another one, kind of asking a question in regards to subcontrols. Is a CIS subcontrol the same as a CIS safeguard?
Yes, it is. I'm sorry if I was confusing there, but we changed the naming I sort of inherited the controls subcontrol thing, and Ron Ross, I'm sure many of you, why did you use the same naming scheme we did at NIST? I said, sorry, Ron, this is the way it worked out historically. So, but we changed now. So CIS control is the top level thing. There used to be 20. You'll see something slightly different in the next version. The next level down, a subcontrol, we now say safeguard. Okay, and that is more closely aligned to what NIST calls a control within the control catalog. And again, there's no single answer to this across the industry. However, again, we would like to remove more confusion if at all possible. And part of that is aligning up the language, right, that all of us use here. So we're trying to be accommodating and open-minded about this and make sure that we're not saying something different just because it's different. So, but we appreciate the question. And again, I'm sorry I was not crisp on that.
And then we have another one here that came in regards to CMMC methods. Do you feel that CMMC methods will spill over into how things are done on the commercial market? So this is really kind of going into asking how it's going to be regarding the commercial market, or will it be a foundation for a national strategy?
Yeah, one of the things I really like about CMMC is it does take a pretty holistic look at this. I offered what might be read as criticism, constructive criticism about this sort of continuous measurement and so forth. But this idea of looking at things like maturity as part of the package, I think is really important, right? So they don't use this language. Our language is, cyber defense is not an event, right? You're building a machine. And so it's a mix of technology and also processes and people. And so the machine has to be operated, right? You have to keep doing things. And part of maturity and methods and so forth are about not just the list of requirements, but how do I actually sort of run the machine, and can I effectively do that? And I think they've taken a pretty holistic look at this. And I know some of the principals who are involved in this, and I think that, they're all good thinkers about these kinds of issues. So now, will that sort of spill into commercial marketplaces? I think with a little thought and sort of design up front, that makes a lot of sense to me. Now, a lot of the commercial frameworks and stuff, are really kind of stuck in the static, episodic model, and could, and everyone is struggling with this, right? So 3 years is an eternity in this business. So much changes. And so the value there is not about the episodes, it's about the between periods. And so when you think of you're designing a machine, then you think of efficiency. You think of what are the inputs, what are the outputs, right? And what are the assumptions that drive the machine, and are things changing? We believe the attackers can do this, and now we find out they can do something else. Quick, I got to turn to my machine. Is my risk any different or not? You have to be able to, the machine should be designed to answer those questions, right? And if you say, well, I've discovered a new flaw in this particular piece of technology, like the scramble with Microsoft Exchange. I remember in the Defense Department, and this was huge. How many of those are out there? Where are they? How are they configured? Is it the vulnerable configuration? Are they outward facing? Nobody knew that, right? Because of the scale. It's just gigantic. And yet you would want to design the machinery and reporting and the tooling in a large enterprise to have all that, right? Those are rational questions that the risk sort of holder wants to ask of the technology. And I think that's the right way to think about it, right? What are the risk questions? So risk, has gone from, I grew up in a world where risk was binary and, trust was binary, right? You're trusted or not. You have a clearance, or you're a DoD contractor, or you're not, and we could define the requirements, right? The government paid the freight, set the RFP requirements, all this stuff. And that doesn't work in this environment here, right? So trust is always going to be negotiated, right? Because your supplier for the DoD is supplying Walmart or the automotive industry, and we're doing this cross borders. So you need to think of, how can I rapidly negotiate trust? Where trust means, if we're going to have a business relationship, we're going to have to share this kind of data and this kind of control path. How will you protect this data if we share this data, right? Will you protect it to my standards or not? Now, the DoD is big enough to think, well, maybe we can impose our standards on the world. Okay. But really, I think the right answer is to kind of negotiate this. It doesn't mean there's no one size fits all, and everyone has to meet the same thing. It means you have to sort of design in, how do I reconcile, you're using this set of commercial standards, and how does that line up to my DoD, level 3 CMMC? That should be predefined, right, by the participants, so that that's natural, so that people know. Because you'd like an environment where you sort of do the work once and prove many times. That would be ideal, right? Where I can say, okay, I know kind of what the core set of things that all these different frameworks ask for, and I just need to focus on those for action, and then present it in different colors, faces, shalls or wills, and so forth. And that's kind of the environment that you're. By the way, anyone who's studied these control catalogs, and I'm sure many of the listeners have, how much of that content is just repeated, right? Whether it's a NIST thing, a DoD thing, a CIS thing, a European thing. There's only, my dad had an old saying, there's only so many ways to slice a banana before it turns to mush. All these things are like 80% the same. I mean, that's my experience. That's why you can cross map against them. Now, some of them, like us, right? We only focus on a certain domain and not the physical domain and so forth. Okay, that's okay. But, with cooperation among more of the sort of creators of these requirements and lists, we could build the infrastructure for this sort of rapid negotiation, right? We don't get a year to negotiate new business things. And by the way, if you're no longer the cheapest supplier to a commercial thing, they want to move you out and move somebody else in. But they don't want to start a 6-month process to revalidate you, right, as a cyber-worthy supply chain. That we need this to be quick. And there are things that the industry has done to sort of standardize some things, warehouse the results of assessments and all that kind of stuff that are all part of the answer.
Hey, it looks like we have another question here. Michael, I'm guessing his question is a little too detailed to type out.
Okay.
Michael, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? I went ahead and unmuted you. I saw you raising your hand. Maybe not. Oh, maybe not. I don't see him talking.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Do we have any remaining questions at this point? Let's see if we had any more. Let's see. I do have one more question. Will CIS Controls V8 version 8 be compatible for V7? Be compatible for V7?
Not compatible in the way you think of it. We will provide clear transition from one to the other. So in the past, and again, CIS has grown significantly since I came on board in 2015. Basically, I was the chief cook and bottle washer and went with an army of volunteers. And so what we were able to produce was pretty informal compared to what we are doing now. One reason we sort of locked down the content is so we could create more transition materials. So you'll have full materials that say, you know, this safeguard version 7.1 is now here, right? And here's some other narrative stuff that we can use to explain that, or where it went, or why it got absorbed into something else, or moved from A to B. So we'll provide much better transition materials than we've ever had before. So I would say if you were currently working on version 7.1, don't panic. There's a lot of great stuff in version 8, but you know there'll be a transition path, and don't you know it's rock solid. We don't have any qualms about the use of it here, but there will be a transition path that you need to think about at some point. If you're in an earlier version, we'll come out with a formal statement about this, but if you're at a much earlier version, you know, it might be time to just sort of bite the bullet. It's time to move. You know, the world has changed a lot in the last several years. And yeah, there's a lot of sort of foundational constants in security that we need to do, but the wording, the emphasis, you know, the accounting for the work from home and all these different new things that we've dealt with over the last year to 2 to 3, you know, means that if you're in an older version, it might be time to move on. And vendors are, you know, we're not quite sure sort of how far backward compatible tools are going to be and that kind of stuff, but you know, certainly back a major number version, we will continue to support for as long as it's around. But yeah, we'll produce more materials. If you have any specific questions, though, drop me a note and I'll be happy to address that or connect you with the team and what they're doing now.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Well, I think
any others? Oh, now,
looking.
for all those that have their orders in for takeout, I would need an address for you here real quick. A bacon bowl, pepperoni, and poppers.
We had some good suggestions.
I tell you, it's working for me. I'm hungry now.
Yeah, it was good. Well, I want to say thank you so much for all of you to attend. We know that this is a hot topic. We're getting a lot of questions as a company, and there are a lot of questions across the board. And I really thank you, Tony, so much for taking the time today to talk with us and just share your insight and answer as many questions as you could. And we truly appreciate that. I do want to just share on this, you should see on my screen here, we've got additional information. If you have any questions, feel free to let us know. Any questions you have regarding what we covered today or anything else, please let us know. And we also have our, I mentioned in the beginning, this is part of a series. So we have part 3 coming up in April, and we are looking forward to that as well. So please register for that. And all of you who attended today, you will receive a copy, you will receive an email, with a link to the recorded webinar. We look forward to hearing from everybody again on the next month and future webinars. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks again. Sorry for the technical glitches up front, unexpected, but we made it through and enjoyed the ride. I think where we're going. Again, any questions that you have, reach out to my friends at SimCore. They're tracking what we're doing very carefully, I know, and or just reach us direct at CIS. Also, and thanks for the opportunity to be here, Mark and Jacqueline. Really appreciate it. You also forced me to think through a bunch of things that we're now. I was just given a task by the boss to write them down and sort of be crisper in our company message about what's happening with CMMC and the support that CIS will provide to it. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of your community, and thank you for the series of things that I think lay out very nicely some of the great discussion about CMMC and its importance. Again, I grew up in the DoD. This is a big problem, and there's nothing quite like the Defense Department in terms of scale and challenge. So all kudos to those that are working these kinds of problems, because they really, really, really are important. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Tony.